The most dangerous kind of cruelty is the kind that does not even pause before it cuts. On a gray November afternoon in a law office above Midtown Manhattan, Nathaniel Cole signed the divorce papers with the same hand he used to close acquisitions, approve mergers, and move millions of dollars before lunch. The pen did not shake. His jaw did not tighten. He did not ask for another minute, did not reread a single line, did not even look long enough at the woman across from him to remember that endings were supposed to carry some weight. He simply signed, capped the pen, and slid it back across the polished walnut table as if a 10-year marriage had been reduced to one more item on a calendar no longer worth discussing. The conference room was wrapped in glass and soft white light, clean and expensive in the sterile way powerful men preferred when they wanted pain to stay neat. Imani Cole sat opposite him in a camel coat over a cream silk blouse, her hands folded lightly over the folder in front of her, her warm brown skin glowing against the cold room like something human the office had not been built to hold. She had not cried. Not in the elevator, not in the reception area, not when Nathaniel's attorney explained the final terms in a voice polished smooth by years of watching rich people divide their lives with legal precision. She had gone still instead, and that stillness made Nathaniel even colder, because men like him always mistook silence for surrender. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled as though something inconvenient had finally been handled. Then he said the line that would follow him for years. "You will not last long without the world I built around you." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sentence landed in the room with the calm confidence of a man who had spent too long believing his money was the same thing as authorship. One of the attorneys glanced down immediately. The other adjusted her pen and pretended to review the signature page, because even in New York, some truths are ugly enough to make strangers embarrassed. Imani lifted her eyes to Nathaniel then, and for a moment the city behind him seemed to disappear. She saw him with a clarity that felt colder than grief. Not the billionaire founder whose name opened rooms. Not the husband whose approval she had once mistaken for safety. Just a man so protected by power that he had confused access with creation. He thought the penthouse had made her refined. He thought the charity circuit had made her useful. He thought the last name had made her visible. He had never once asked what she brought into every room before he arrived in it. Imani closed the folder, rose from her chair, and gathered her bag with steady hands. No speech, no pleading, no final attempt to rescue the image of a marriage already dead enough to fit into legal binders. Nathaniel watched her stand, and in his expression there was the faintest trace of satisfaction, the dangerous kind that appears when a man mistakes composure for defeat. Outside the building, Manhattan was wrapped in fine cold rain that silvered the sidewalks and blurred the avenue into streaks of headlights and black umbrellas. Imani stepped through the revolving door into that weather without looking back. The city air hit her face sharp and real, carrying the smell of wet pavement, traffic, and something else she had not felt in years. Space. Behind her, high above the street, Nathaniel remained in the glass room believing he had just watched a woman walk out of his world. He did not yet understand that what had really left that room was his only chance to ever be fully known. The rain followed Imani 3 blocks south before she finally stopped beneath the dark green awning of a hotel cafe she had no interest in entering. And for the first time all afternoon, the city stopped sounding like background noise and started sounding like proof that life was still moving without asking what had just ended. Water gathered at the hem of her coat, slid from the leather strap of her bag, and dotted the sidewalk in small silver marks while taxis hissed through wet intersections and strangers hurried past beneath black umbrellas, their faces turned toward appointments, dinner reservations, and lives that had nothing to do with hers. Imani stood still enough to feel the cold reach through the silk at her wrists and settle into her bones. Nathaniel's sentence remained inside her, hard and polished and expensive in the way cruel things often are when spoken by men, who have never once had to question whether the room belonged to them. "You will not last long without the world I built around you." She let the words replay one more time, not to wound herself with them, but to hear them clearly enough that they could never again disguise themselves as concern. Then she opened her bag, silenced 2 calls from Nathaniel's assistant, and slipped her phone back inside without reading the messages. There was nothing he could send now that would make the signature less real. By evening, she was in a furnished apartment on the Upper West Side, rented month to month, with beige walls, a narrow galley kitchen, a twin lamp that cast weak yellow light over a chipped table, and a single window facing a brick wall close enough to turn the city into echo rather than view. The place smelled faintly of steam heat and old detergent. It was not elegant. It was not permanent. It was not a home yet. But it was quiet, and the quiet belonged to her. She set her bag on the bed, removed her damp coat, and sat at the small table in the kitchenette with the divorce folders still unopened in front of her. For several minutes, she only listened to the sounds around her, the radiator clicking awake, footsteps passing overhead, the low rumble of buses on the avenue below, and in that ordinary noise she realized something strange. Nathaniel had signed as if he were releasing her from his world. But he had also, without meaning to, released her from having to survive inside his definition of herself. The thought did not comfort her. Not yet. Pain still occupied too much of the room. But it changed the shape of it. She opened the folder at last, removed the copy of the signed papers, and stared at the bottom of the final page where both their names sat in ink like strangers forced to share a line. Beside the folder lay one of her old business cards, worn at the edges from years in handbags and charity folders and dinner seating files. Imani Cole, Community Relations. She turned it over and wrote 3 words on the blank back in small, neat letters. Capital. Narrative. Recovery. Then she wrote 3 more. Learn what lasts. The card looked almost absurd beneath the yellow lamp, like the first line of a future too quiet to believe in yet. Still, she slid it into her wallet instead of throwing it away. Across the city, Nathaniel returned to a penthouse full of glass, marble, and warm recessed lighting that had once impressed people before they learned how empty beauty could feel when no one tender remained inside it. He poured a drink, loosened his tie, and stood before the windows convinced that silence meant control. He told himself she had left because she could not face reality. He told himself the world would teach her quickly what he already knew. But while he looked out at Manhattan as if it still answered to him, Imani sat in a small rented kitchen facing a brick wall and began, in the smallest possible way, to build a life that would one day make his certainty look childish. The first year after the divorce did not look dramatic enough to satisfy anyone who believed reinvention arrived in a single montage of better clothes and sharper cheekbones. It looked like fluorescent grocery store light at 9 o'clock, subway delays in wet boots, and Imani sitting alone at the little kitchen table in that Upper West Side apartment with a calculator, an aging laptop, and a stack of library books about finance, restructuring, and capital strategy spread around her like a second language she was refusing to mispronounce. She worked during the day for whoever would pay her to think clearly. A women-led nonprofit in Queens that needed grant messaging rewritten before a donor withdrew support. A small beauty brand in Brooklyn with a good product and no idea how to speak to investors without sounding either desperate or decorative. A founder in Harlem who had vision, grit, and terrible decks. None of it looked glamorous from the outside. None of it carried Nathaniel's kind of prestige. But every job taught her the same quiet lesson. Money was not magic. It was structure, story, timing, confidence delivered in the correct order. In the evenings, she studied what men like Nathaniel had always treated as instinctive territory: private equity mechanics, asset valuation, distressed brand recovery, board psychology, and the invisible choreography of influence that determined who got believed in a room full of expensive doubt. Some nights, she fell asleep with legal pads covered in numbers and notes beneath her cheek. Some mornings she woke before dawn, reheated stale coffee, and kept going because pain had lost its usefulness and discipline had become more reliable. Nathaniel, meanwhile, continued moving through his world with the polished certainty of a man whose calendar never left enough room for self-examination. He expanded his holdings, appeared on 2 magazine covers, and hosted private dinners in the penthouse where investors complimented the skyline, and no one remarked on how the place seemed colder now, because wealthy people are trained to call absence minimalist design if the marble is expensive enough. At first, he thought of Imani only in brief, dismissive flashes, usually when some household detail failed quietly without her hand behind it, or when a room he once believed he dominated lost its rhythm for reasons he could not name. He told himself she had chosen hardship out of pride. He told himself the city would eventually correct her illusions. What he did not know was that 18 months after the divorce, a midnight phone call changed the shape of Imani's future. A founder named Celia Warren, recommended by a nonprofit contact, called in tears because the lifestyle company she had spent 6 years building was hemorrhaging money, bleeding public trust, and preparing to be stripped apart by an investor who called it efficiency. Imani listened for nearly an hour without interrupting, then asked 6 questions so precise that Celia went quiet after each one. 2 weeks later, Imani was in Chicago with 1 carry-on suitcase, a charcoal coat, and a strategy plan broken down in neat black sections. She reworked the narrative first, then the operating structure, then the way the founder herself entered rooms. She cut what was ornamental, protected what was real, and taught Celia how to stop explaining her value like an apology. The company survived, then stabilized, then returned profitable enough to make the same investor who wanted to dismantle it ask for a private meeting. That meeting became another referral, then another. Imani stopped writing ideas on the backs of old business cards and began using cream stock embossed only with her initials. She opened a business account, then a private office share, then a real client list. And somewhere in the slow, unspectacular accumulation of those years, Nathaniel's sentence stopped sounding like a prophecy and started sounding like the most expensive mistake he had ever made. By the 3rd year, the city had stopped treating Imani like a woman in transition and started treating her like something far more difficult to ignore. Her name began appearing in places Nathaniel never expected to see it. First in a trade column buried halfway through a financial newsletter, then in the quiet language of investor briefings, then in the polished conversations that floated between cocktails at private dinners where money liked to pretend it had discovered integrity on its own. Imani Cole had become the person founders called when a company was too damaged for vanity and too valuable to abandon. She was not loud. She was not public in the way New York often rewarded. She did not sit for glossy profiles or attach herself to panels unless the room mattered. But inside the worlds that moved real capital, the ones built on referrals rather than headlines, her reputation was hardening into something expensive. She now worked from a discreet office suite in Tribeca with frosted glass, pale oak floors, and a conference room so quiet people lowered their voices the moment they entered it. The plaque outside the door said only Cole Advisory. No slogan, no decorative ambition, just her name in black letters that did not ask to be remembered because they already were. Imani had changed too, though not in the obvious ways people with less imagination would have praised first. Yes, the money had come. There was now a black car account, a loft purchased under her own name, a closet built from exact decisions rather than hopeful impulse, a watch so understated only powerful people recognized its price. But what had really transformed was the temperature of her presence. The woman who once entered rooms hoping to be understood now entered knowing precisely what she could do for them and exactly what access would cost. Her kindness had not disappeared. It had acquired gates. Nathaniel noticed her rise the way a man notices a crack in marble, first as inconvenience, then as pattern, then as evidence that the structure beneath him may not be as permanent as he assumed. One morning his chief of staff left a market brief on the breakfast counter of the penthouse, beside his untouched espresso and a bowl of fruit no one ever finished. Nathaniel glanced down between emails and froze at a line halfway through the second page. Cole Advisory had quietly led. The recovery of a consumer brand his own firm had once declined to touch, calling it too unstable to save. Yet there it was in black type, restructured, solvent, newly profitable, and being cited as a case study in strategic recovery. He read the paragraph twice, not because he doubted the words, but because he did not know what to do with the feeling that followed them. It was not yet regret. Regret required humility, and Nathaniel was not there. What he felt was irritation sharpened by recognition. The same week, he hosted 12 people in the penthouse for a dinner benefiting an arts education initiative. The flowers were perfect. The city stretched behind the glass like a private possession. The chef sent out courses so precise they looked composed rather than cooked. Yet halfway through the evening, while a venture capitalist discussed cultural leadership in his careful, expensive voice, Nathaniel found himself looking at the room as if from the outside. The conversation was smooth. The wine was excellent. But something about the night felt polished in all the wrong places, beautiful and bloodless, like a performance that no longer believed its own lines. Years ago, Imani would have understood exactly where the evening was failing and corrected it before anyone noticed. She would have changed the energy with one seating shift, one better question, one soft intervention at the right moment. Nathaniel lifted his glass and heard only the silence around what used to be there. Across the city, in her Tribeca office, Imani stood before a wall of printed strategy maps with her sleeves pushed to the elbow, listening to a founder explain why his company deserved one last chance. Her face gave him nothing easy. Then, after a long pause, she told him exactly what could be saved, what had to be cut, and what truth he would finally have to face if he wanted the business to live. He stared at her as though no one had ever spoken to him that plainly before. Imani did not soften the message. She only made it useful. And in that moment, while Nathaniel sat inside a penthouse still beautiful enough to impress strangers and empty enough to betray him, the life he had once dismissed was becoming the kind of force rooms rearranged themselves around. By the 5th year, Nathaniel no longer heard Imani's name as an accident. It began arriving with the consistency of weather, first in the small, disciplined corners of his world where real information traveled before headlines caught up, then in rooms large enough to embarrass him with their certainty. A managing director mentioned Cole Advisory over lunch at the Yale Club while discussing a consumer company everyone else had left for dead. A board member at one of Nathaniel's portfolio firms asked, almost casually, whether they had ever considered bringing Imani in on a distressed hospitality asset because, in his words, she seems to understand recovery at the level of human behavior, not just numbers. Later that month, a financial profile crossed Nathaniel's desk with her photograph set beside an article on private strategists reshaping fragile companies without public spectacle. She was not smiling in the picture. She did not need to. Her expression carried the kind of calm that came from being expensive enough to refuse almost everyone. Nathaniel read the piece twice, irritated by how little of it felt exaggerated. It described her as discreet, exacting, and unusually effective at restoring value where pride had already done damage. He closed the article and told himself New York loved building myths around women who had survived powerful men. But the city was not mythologizing her. It was adjusting to her. Even his penthouse had begun to feel like a museum of choices that no longer defended him. The marble still gleamed. The skyline still unfolded beyond the glass like a private kingdom. The art on the walls still suggested cultivated taste to people who did not know better. Yet there were evenings now when Nathaniel came home from dinners and meetings and heard only the thin echo of his own movement through rooms that used to feel inhabited by something warmer than success. Money had kept everything beautiful. It had not kept anything alive. One Thursday near the end of winter, his assistant left a black portfolio on the breakfast counter marked with the seal of the Cole Foundation Gala, a philanthropic event his firm had underwritten for years because it offered the right kind of photographs, the right kind of proximity, the right kind of moral shine for people whose wealth required careful lighting. Nathaniel opened the portfolio while the espresso machine hissed behind him and scanned the evening program with detached familiarity. Sponsor recognition. Trustee remarks. Capital Initiative pledge. Then his eyes caught on a line halfway down the page and stopped. Keynote conversation. Imani Cole, founder of Cole Advisory and principal investor in the Bennett Restoration Fund. He stood very still with one hand resting against the stone counter, the dark city beyond the windows beginning to glow with late winter light. Founder. Investor. Her name was no longer slipping past him in trade notes or whispered referrals. It had been placed in the center of one of his own rooms. Nathaniel read the line again, then turned the page as if more context might make the shock smaller. Instead, he found a short bio, clean and unforgiving in its elegance. Strategic advisor to distressed brands. Private capital consultant. Known for turning collapsing institutions into solvent, credible businesses with restored market trust. There it was in black print, everything he had once implied she would never understand. He set the portfolio down, picked it up again, and felt something unfamiliar move through him, not jealousy, not even disbelief, but the slow beginning of a truth too large to dismiss. For years he had told himself she was surviving. The paper in his hand suggested something far worse for his pride. Imani had not survived him. She had become the kind of woman entire evenings were now built around, and in 3 days he would have to sit in a ballroom funded by his own name, and watched the city rise when hers was announced. On the night of the gala, Manhattan looked carved from black glass and winter breath, every curb lit by headlights, and every doorway framed in the kind of gold light that made money look almost holy from a distance. Nathaniel arrived just after 7 beneath the striped awning of the Cole Foundation venue, stepping from the back of a black car into cold air sharp enough to clear a man's thoughts if he was willing to have them cleared. He was dressed as he always was for rooms like this: black tuxedo, white shirt, polished shoes, a face arranged into the calm confidence people mistook for certainty. Inside, the ballroom glowed in cream, amber, and crystal, all white orchids, mirrored candlelight, and linen folded with military precision. Trustees moved from table to table. Donors embraced. A string quartet traced something elegant through the room. Nathaniel shook hands, accepted gratitude for his firm's continued support, and answered remarks about the market with the same measured control that had carried him through every boardroom and benefit dinner of his adult life. But beneath that control, the evening felt wrong in a way he could not disguise from himself. There was an anticipatory current running through the room that had nothing to do with him. He could feel it each time someone glanced toward the ballroom doors before returning to a conversation. He could hear it in the names being dropped between courses, in the subtle rise of interest each time a guest asked whether she had arrived yet. No one needed to say more. By the time the first course had been cleared, Nathaniel had the unnerving sensation of attending an event he funded but did not command. Then the light softened. The quartet let its final note dissolve. The host stepped to the stage, smiled into the hush, and thanked the room for believing in restoration, dignity, and the work of rebuilding what others were too quick to abandon. Nathaniel felt his fingers tighten once around the stem of his glass. The host continued, voice warm and practiced. Tonight, before we begin our capital initiative, it is my honor to welcome a woman whose work has changed the way this city thinks about recovery. The room leaned forward almost physically. Nathaniel turned toward the entrance at the same moment everyone else did. Imani stepped through the doors without hurry, wearing a black gown so exact in its cut, it looked less chosen than declared. The fabric held the light and returned it sparingly. Small diamonds rested at her ears and throat, cold and deliberate, like punctuation rather than decoration. Her hair was swept back from her face, her posture calm, her expression neither smiling nor severe, only composed in a way that made the entire ballroom seem suddenly louder for not matching it. What struck Nathaniel first was not that she looked beautiful. Beauty had never been the point, and for the first time he understood that fully. What struck him was scale. Money moved around her now as if it recognized its own equal. Influence moved around her. Attention moved around her. A board chair crossed the room to greet her personally. 2 women from a private capital fund he had spent months trying to court stepped away from his table without apology, to introduce themselves to her instead. An older philanthropist known for respecting almost no one rose from his seat before she even reached the stage. The room did not merely notice Imani. It rearranged itself around her. Nathaniel stood in the center of it all and realized, with a shock too clean to call jealousy, that the woman he once expected the world to humble had walked into one of his own rooms and become the name everyone had really come to hear. The applause rose in waves rather than all at once, as if the ballroom needed several seconds to adjust to the truth of what it was seeing. Nathaniel had spent years watching rooms respond to him with practiced admiration, donors smiling before he reached their table, trustees leaning in when he spoke, investors treating his silence like a strategy instead of a mood. But what happened now was different, and somewhere beneath his ribs he knew it instantly. This was not courtesy. It was gravity. Imani moved through the center aisle with the slow, unforced precision of a woman who no longer mistook attention for approval. The board chair met her halfway and took both her hands in a greeting so warm it bordered on reverence. A trustee from a private capital fund introduced her to 2 people Nathaniel had been trying to cultivate for 6 months, and they turned toward her with the eagerness usually reserved for someone who could change the direction of their future. The host smiled toward the ballroom and spoke her name again, this time with the polished pride of a city presenting one of its own. Imani Cole, founder, investor, and one of the most exacting private strategists in the country. The last phrase landed like a quiet detonation. Nathaniel felt it in the sudden hush around him, in the way conversations did not resume, in the unmistakable shift of bodies and eyes and energy. He had once believed wealth meant ownership of the room. Now he watched a room, he helped funds surrender itself willingly to the woman he had once dismissed as someone who could not outlast his absence. She reached the stage beneath warm gold light, and the black of her gown turned almost liquid against the cream backdrop. Her name appeared on the screen in clean white letters, simple and expensive in the way only true stature ever becomes. Imani Cole. No added explanation. No need for one. She stood at the lectern with one hand resting lightly along its edge and waited until the applause settled on its own. Nathaniel had forgotten how dangerous patience looked on someone who no longer needed anything from the people in front of her. Then she began to speak. Her voice was lower than he remembered and steadier than anything in the room around her. She talked about recovery, not as a miracle or a brand angle, but as discipline. She spoke of companies that failed long before the market admitted it, of leaders who confused noise for trust, of the cost of building institutions on ego instead of truth. She spoke about how real restoration required the courage to face what had been neglected, misread, or carelessly discarded. The ballroom listened with the kind of silence that cannot be bought, because it comes only when people know they are hearing someone who has already paid for every word. Nathaniel stood there with his untouched drink and realized the richness in her had nothing to do with the diamonds at her throat or the board seats now attached to her name. She was richer in timing, richer in discipline, richer in that terrifying emotional solvency that let her stand before a city and owe it nothing except the truth. She was colder too, but not in the shallow way bitter people like to imagine. Her coldness was not cruelty. It was refinement. It was warmth with walls. It was the temperature of a life no longer accessible to men who had once mistaken kindness for dependence. And untouchable, Nathaniel understood now, did not mean unreachable because she hated him. It meant unreachable because she had healed enough to make his regret irrelevant. By the time the room rose again at the end of her remarks, Nathaniel no longer felt like the man whose name shimmered across sponsor cards and foundation plaques. He felt like a witness to the most expensive mistake of his life, standing in a ballroom full of people who had just confirmed what years had been trying to teach him, that Imani had not come back to be seen by him at all. She had returned as proof. The applause did not disappear when Imani stepped away from the lectern. It trailed after her like light, lingering. In the ballroom, in the eyes that followed her, in the sudden care with which people approached her, as though proximity itself now required tact. Nathaniel remained where he was for several seconds, one hand still around the untouched glass, while donors and trustees crossed the room with practiced smiles and newly urgent interest. He watched a venture partner from Boston ask for 10 minutes of her time. He watched a foundation chair from Chicago laugh softly at something she said. He watched the city he thought he understood rearrange itself around the woman he had once signed away without hesitation. By the time dinner service resumed and the string quartet returned to a low, elegant murmur, Nathaniel could no longer pretend the pressure inside his chest was surprise. Surprise belonged to accidents. This was recognition delayed, so long it had become punishment. He moved only when he saw Imani step through the side doors into the corridor beyond the ballroom, where the lights softened and the air lost its perfume of orchids and expensive candle wax. The hallway was lined with cream paneling and old gilt mirrors that reflected fragments of passing waitstaff and gold light from the room beyond. Imani, he said. Her name left his mouth more quietly than he intended, but it carried. She stopped near a marble console table holding a silver bowl of white camellias and turned after a beat that felt deliberate enough to be its own answer. Up close, she looked even more composed, the diamonds at her throat catching the hallway light with a chill almost architectural. There was no anger in her face, no visible wound, only a stillness so complete it made him feel loud without speaking. I only need a minute, he said, and immediately hated how small the sentence sounded. Imani rested one hand lightly against her black clutch and regarded him with the calm of someone deciding whether a closed door even justified being acknowledged. Then take less than that, she said. The corridor seemed to narrow around them. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a burst of polite laughter rose and fell. Nathaniel swallowed once, not because he lacked words, but because for the first time in years he could not trust power to arrange them for him. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what you were capable of. About what I thought my life gave you." Imani's expression did not change, but something in the silence sharpened. "Capable of?" she repeated. Nathaniel looked at her fully then, at the woman who had walked into one of his own rooms and made his name feel secondary. "You know what I mean." "I do," she said. "That is exactly why you should hear how wrong you still are." The words landed cleanly. Nathaniel felt them in the same place the applause had hurt him, deep enough to matter. "You keep speaking as if I became something after you," she continued, her voice low and even. "As if all of this is shocking because I transformed. I did not become valuable when you lost me. I was valuable when you signed." He lowered his eyes for a moment because there was no defense that would not sound childish now. "I spent years regretting that day," he said. Imani inclined her head slightly, not tender, not cruel, simply exact. "I know," she said. "That is what happens when a man mistakes speed for certainty." Her gaze moved past him toward the ballroom doors, where the host was already searching the room for her next introduction. Then she looked back at Nathaniel one final time, and in that look was the full distance of years he could never negotiate back. "Your regret does not change my life," she said. "It only tells the truth about yours." For a moment after Imani spoke, the corridors seemed to lose all sound except the distant murmur of the ballroom and the soft, expensive quiet of a building designed to protect powerful people from ever having to hear themselves too clearly. Nathaniel stood in that hush with his hands at his sides, looking at the woman he had once measured by proximity to his own name and realizing, too late to be useful, that he had never understood scale at all. Imani did not wait for an answer because none was needed. She inclined her head once, the gesture formal enough to end the conversation without cruelty, then turned back toward the doors where warm golden light spilled around the edges and the city's most polished faces were already searching for her. Nathaniel watched her walk away with the same calm, exact stride she had brought into the room, and something in him broke not loudly, not theatrically, but with the quiet internal finality of a man realizing the past had just refused to reopen for him. He returned to the ballroom a minute later only because there was nowhere else for him to go. The music had resumed. Dinner had advanced. Glasses caught candlelight and returned it in trembling gold across white linen and silver. Yet nothing in the room felt the way it had before she entered. Even his own table, marked with the foundation's gratitude and his firm's sponsorship, now looked less like proof of influence than evidence of how little money could do once the truth had changed the temperature of a space. Across the room, Imani stood near the stage speaking with the board chair and two investors whose attention was total, effortless, earned. She did not look back toward Nathaniel again. She did not need to. The room had already done what rooms do when real value finally becomes visible. It had corrected itself. Later, after photographs, introductions, and a final round of applause for the capital initiative she had just made more believable by standing inside it, Imani moved through the lobby with a camel coat draped over her shoulders, her black clutch in one hand and the evening's glass award case in the other. The marble floors reflected the chandelier light in long pale streaks. Outside the revolving doors, Manhattan gleamed with recent rain, headlights stretching across wet pavement like lines of molten brass. A black car waited beneath the awning. Her driver stepped forward the moment he saw her. Nathaniel had followed at a distance without meaning to, drawn not by hope exactly, but by that final instinct people have when they know a door is closing and still want one last look at the world on the other side. He stopped several feet away under the warm hotel lights, careful now in a way he had never been when it mattered. Imani turned when she sensed him there. In the hush between traffic and winter air, she looked at him fully for the first time that night, and there was no anger in her eyes, no performance, no lingering wish for him to finally understand. Only certainty. "You did not break me with that signature," she said, her voice low and even against the rain-bright city. "You only revealed how little you understood about what I already was." Nathaniel felt the sentence land. In the same place every year of regret had been quietly building their home. He could not answer it because nothing he said would stand beside it without collapsing. The driver opened the rear door. Imani gave Nathaniel one last measured look, not intimate, not unkind, simply final, then stepped into the car with the composure of a woman entering a future she had built with both hands. The door closed with a soft, expensive sound that seemed to finish something inside him. The sedan pulled away from the curb and slipped into the Manhattan night, carrying with it the woman he had once dismissed as fragile and leaving him beneath the hotel awning with marble, money, and the knowledge that some men spend years regretting a moment they thought meant nothing, only to discover that the moment had meant everything.